Good evening. I'm Cameo George, Executive Producer of American Experience, PBS's longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're pleased to present an extended preview of our film, The American Vice President, which premieres on October 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central on PBS stations nationwide. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, and of course, viewers like you. The American Vice President explores the little known story of the second highest office in the land, tracing its evolution from a constitutional afterthought to a position of political consequence. Focusing on the fraught period between 1963 and 1974, when a grief stricken and then scandal plagued America was forced to clarify the role of the vice president, the film examines the passage and first uses of the 25th Amendment and offers a fresh and surprising perspective on succession in the executive branch. We'll start with a brief overview of the film, and then we'll jump into the struggle to codify the rules of presidential succession and the evolution of the role of vice president, starting with the unfortunate events leading to the ascension of Lyndon B. Johnson. It is my privilege to introduce our panelists for this conversation. Michelle Ferrari is the writer, director, and producer of The American Vice President. She has created innovative, critically acclaimed documentary narratives for more than 2 decades. Her credits for American Experience include Edison, Rachel Carson, The Eugenics Crusade, The Vote, and most recently, The Riot Report. Her work has garnered honors from the Writers Guild of America, the Western Writers Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Sundance Film Festival, and the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. James E. Hite is an interviewed expert in the film and author of Second Best, The Rise of the American Vice Presidency. He is a writer and lead political scientist at Clackamas Community College. I'll just remind you that we will also take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Michelle, I'm going to start with you. People ask me a lot why we decided to make this film now, and if we decided to make this film in response to the rise of Kamala Harris. I always tell people we've been working on this for nearly a year, but how do you answer when people come to you? What do you remember about the initial musings about this film?
Well, first, I just want to take a moment and absorb the timetable of making this film since the rise of Kamala Harris. That would be a little mind-boggling. In any event, we started making this film last fall in October, and I felt like the motive at that point had to do with the likely nominees for president being quite advanced in age, and wanting people to be thinking about the vice president and reflecting on the vice presidency in a new way, rather than just like, the other face on the ticket. So that's where we started, and we were feeling like it was pretty relevant all the way through the making of it, and then it became relevant in new ways with each sort of rotation of the news cycle.
Indeed, indeed. And now in this most current iteration, we have landed at this film premiering directly before the vice presidential debate. So it really is just an amazing turn of events. Yeah.
Timing is all.
Timing is all. James, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. Thank you for being here. Why do you think that the role of the vice president has been such a mystery or afterthought for the American public?
I think that's in part vice president vice presidency has been a bit of an enigma, um, mainly because the vice president works in the shadow of the president, and so unless there's some sort of crisis or major event that would draw the vice president out, they don't really have many opportunities to emerge from the shadows, so to speak. And I think that's why it's just, if they weren't in conjunction with the most powerful position in our government, and being elected with them, then maybe there would be more attention to it. But it's, again, as I said, it's like that shadow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Michelle, in the making of this film, how has your understanding of the role changed or evolved? If it has, maybe it hasn't, but if it has, how?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I like so much about this work and why I feel so privileged to do it is you often start out a project knowing little or nothing about a given subject. And over the course of the making of the film, you learn a great deal. I wouldn't say you wind up an expert, but you're at least able to have a cogent conversation with an expert. So I'm not sure that I had any particular conception of the vice president before I began. It was just sort of, as James just said, like this fairly invisible figure on Capitol Hill. But over the course of making the film, the year of making the film, I learned a lot. And I was really very surprised at the ambiguity in the Constitution around the role and the way in which that remained kind of a cloud, as Joel Goldstein says in the film, that hung over the nation, and not constantly, but that kept coming and going. And also was really encouraged, I guess is the word, by the way in which Americans on Capitol Hill, led by Birch Bayh, took the issue on and actually passed an amendment to the Constitution that improved the situation for everybody, not least the vice president.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And James, can you talk a little bit? I know that we just saw part of the clip we saw a part of the film, but how has the role evolved over time? Like, how do you see it blossoming into what we know it as today?
Yeah. Well, while the duties of the vice president in the Constitution have remained the same, the vice presidency really has evolved over time, but it's been able to evolve really because of the presidents or specific presidents. And what I mean by that is, and I've said this in things that I've written before too, that what makes the vice presidency matter is the presidency on a whole different number of fronts. But in terms of your question, over the years, vice presidents being given more substantial responsibilities, more substantial portfolios, and just a larger role, and so certain presidents allowing that and augmenting that has allowed the institution to evolve and get bigger in a sense. Well, actually, literally bigger in terms of staff and whatnot, and then also just in terms of the significance of that elected vice president and what they can and cannot do. And again, it really just depends on the presidents that are willing to do that. The only catch with what I just said is that the presidents can retract certain things. And so if you have a situation where the president doesn't want the vice president to be involved in something, they can pull that back. And so then they can diminish the institution in a way. A great example of that was with President Johnson and Vice President Humphrey. Humphrey initially was integrated into the executive government, etc. But he had a different take on Vietnam, and he dared to speak it. And so Lyndon Johnson started cutting him out of conversations about the war. By statute, Vice President Humphrey, was a part of the National Security Council. So Johnson had to have him attend those meetings. But what he did was, just after Humphrey left, he conducted another meeting with intimates and discussed war policy and left Humphrey out of it. So again, like I said, they can augment it or they can retract it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have a question from an audience member. That's actually putting the two of you on the spot a little bit, so I may redirect the question. But the question, as written, is, can you rank from best to worst the vice presidents who ascended to the presidency after death or resignation? I don't necessarily want to force you to say who's the best vice president, who's the worst in your estimation, but I am curious to, following on the answer that you were just giving, James, can you talk even just a little bit more about some of the vice presidents who made the role bigger than it was on paper, or who amassed the most power? You talked about, there are a number of vice presidents who, just truly made the role bigger, whether it's staff, budget. Can you talk about that a little bit? And Michelle, you as well.
You want to go first, Michelle?
I think you're probably more qualified to answer the question. I mean, I think, when I think of the sort of broad sweep of the office, Richard Nixon really stands out to me as a vice president who kind of pushed the bounds of the office and made it into something else. And of course, that had a lot to do with the fact that Eisenhower was ill, and knew he was ill, and kind of gave Nixon a lot more latitude than the average president gives his VP, or gave his VP in those days. James, thoughts?
On vice presidents that have contributed to the growth of it? Is that what you're asking, right? Yeah. I would say without question, the most influential, I don't know about best or worst, but the most influential vice president who influenced the institution and the growth of the institution, and the notions of the institution, would be Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was Franklin Roosevelt's second vice president, and he was, Roosevelt, I should say, had great confidence in him. Roosevelt, during World War II, gave his vice president, Wallace, gave him responsibilities, like he ran two different bureaus, government bureaus that were created specifically for the war effort. He was in charge of those, and he became really what I would suggest is the first vice president as administrator. Vice presidents now will be given commissions and task forces and things like that. That had never happened until, prior to Wallace getting these responsibilities, and very important responsibilities in the war. The other sort of anecdote, I guess you would say, that about Wallace that I find very interesting is that Wallace was included by President Roosevelt in an initial, I think it was 5-person task force that met secretly about the development of the atomic bomb. Wallace was included in those discussions, and he was sort of the president's personal representative at these secret meetings. And then you fast forward to Harry Truman ended up being Wallace's third vice president, and he was only vice president about 3 months before Roosevelt died, and he had no idea that the United States possessed atomic weapons. And so I think that tells you something about the stature of Henry Wallace, certainly as a vice president, and that President Roosevelt didn't view Truman in the same way. So that was a long answer to a short question. Henry Wallace is who I'd say.
We don't mind long answers. We don't mind long answers when they contain as much insight as that. So thank you.
Sure.
Can we talk a little bit about the way that vice presidential candidates are chosen and how that's changed over time? Because both of you are pointing to the fact that some vice presidents have had a lot of power, some have had much less. And we're talking overall about how much stock we should put into the vice presidency. Um, I think a lot of that depends on, as we're saying, who they are and what they bring to the ticket. So it would be kind of, I think there are people in the audience who are asking, like, how has it changed over time? We talked about this a little bit actually before the session started, when we were talking privately, that there are historically things that presidents try to achieve with their picks. James, do you want to start?
Well, in terms of how vice presidential nominees changing over time, throughout the 19th and early 20th century, vice presidential nominees were chosen by party elites at party conventions. And it wasn't until, who I was just speaking about, it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt ran for his third term as president that the choice of the vice presidential nominee became the exclusive prerogative of the president or presidential nominee. And in that case, Roosevelt said he would only run for a third term if he got Henry Wallace as his vice president. So that set the precedent of presidential nominees choosing the vice presidential nominee, which is significant when, again, it had just been party elites doing it, and they had nothing. The presidential nominee had nothing to do with it. And another aspect of that that's kind of interesting is that you had, again, in the 18th and 19th centuries, you had presidential candidates, or excuse me, the 19th and 20th centuries, you had presidential candidates who had never met the vice presidential nominee. One of the most famous, until after the election. And one of the most famous examples I have of that is Abraham Lincoln and his first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. They had never met until after they won the election. And Hamlin later gave an account of, like, his first conversation with Lincoln was saying, "Hey, we've never met before, have we?" "No, we never have." And they were president-elect and vice president-elect. So that's obviously considerably different than today. So.
And Michelle, I have to say, one of the things that I always marvel at in watching this film, and and watching you make this film with us, is how many fun facts we just didn't know in the making of it. And so, James is pointing to one of those, that there were actually times where the number one and number two on the ticket didn't even know each other. Another thing that you talk about in the film that I just found so incredible was that I honestly, I apologize to my history teachers that I just didn't remember, was that initially it was the person with the second most votes. So again, were there other things like that that struck you about the selection process?
Well, certainly the fact that, the original method of election had the electors casting two ballots. And this was in large measure to ensure that it was a national election, a national office. There was a fear that people would only vote for politicians in their states, candidates in their states. And so one ballot had to be cast for someone outside of your state. And the person, as the film notes, with the most votes was president, and second most votes was vice president. When that changed, the office, again, as the film notes, became less interesting to most people. And I think this phase was full of very funny surprises, right? Like, the 19th century is full of funny anecdotes, things that you wouldn't expect from the second highest office in the land. Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the vice president to, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget his name. Help me out, James.
He was vice president for Martin Van Buren.
Martin Van Buren,
Is that
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, so, he spent most of his term in his native state of Kentucky running a tavern. Teddy Roosevelt expected to be able to go to law school during his term, and famously said that the office was a stepping stone only to obscurity. Oblivion, I believe, is actually what he said. So the fact that, you know, an office that had so little heft, and that, you know, the people who held the office themselves thought of it as a punchline for decades, makes the fact that it is an office of consequence even more interesting, or that it's become an office of consequence. But yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of full of fun facts.
A question from the audience. In your opinion, did the enactment of the 25th Amendment accelerate the growth and importance of the vice presidency?
I mean, I would say that it opened the door to a new vision, you know, of the vice presidency. That, as James has pointed out, prior to the 25th Amendment, there were certainly presidents who gave their VPs things to do. I feel like once the nation and the Constitution acknowledges that the vice president is an important role, it opens the door to like a more rapid cause and effect kind of evolution from one administration to another. So that when you have Carter and Mondale basically approaching governance as a team, that starts to become a model that other vice presidents want to follow.
I could add something to that.
Please.
I was, in terms of Carter and Mondale too, they really set, and I think Ford and Rockefeller did as well a little bit, but they really created this model of, you know, vice president and president being partners, that there was an actual partnership and a relationship, and where they would meet alone, just the two of them, and go over policy and no aides and involved and whatnot. And so I think that was really important, and that partnership idea that Mondale and Carter created has continued to this day, with only one exception, and where you would say it was not a partnership in that relationship. So that model has really stuck and been effective.
Another audience question. Why doesn't the 25th Amendment rely on the Congress to decide whether the president can perform his duties rather than the cabinet, who might be beholden to him?
I would think
James, do you want?
the easiest answer would be simply that the cabinet and a majority of the cabinet and the vice president together, which is in Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, they can just act more swiftly than if you had the entire Congress debating it. You know, they could just, if there's an inability in existence, it's much easier to get however many people that adds up to than 535 in Congress.
And
I
arguably,
just,
if there's an inability, there's a crisis, right? So time is of the essence.
Yeah, and inability in and of itself is a crisis, you know, so yeah.
Mhm. And you know, one of the aspects of the film that's so interesting is we show and in the clip we saw this, the example of Eisenhower, how it was a gentleman's agreement between him and Nixon, and it was like up to them to decide, right? Like there were no grand mechanisms in place. We see in the film the example of Woodrow Wilson, where his wife and secretary decide that they're going to decide whether or not to share with the public. Is that problematic? Like, is that ambiguity around the 25th Amendment a problem? Is it something that should be further hammered out? I'm curious, James, if you have a take on that.
Do you mean in terms of what you're talking about or speaking of before about Congress? being involved? I mean, because
Oh,
I wouldn't suggest there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, I think it's pretty straight in terms of, it's pretty straightforward in the mechanics of how you deal with an inability. It's not too straightforward about what constitutes an inability, and that could become a slippery slope, you know, and it becomes rather subjective, right? Especially in the case where you have the vice president and the cabinet getting together and saying, "Hey, we think there's something going on here, so we're going to make the vice president acting president."
mhm, mhm.
You know, so
Right. And Michelle, one of the funny examples, you talked about how there are a lot of little funny episodes in the film. The Great Usurper is one of my
Right,
favorites.
right.
His accidency. Right.
John Tyler, who just, blew through whatever ambiguity existed in the Constitution and decided he was president. And, I mean, I think that was a very bold move. It took a very particular kind of person. I remember when we were animating the photos, the paintings that are in that sequence, the animator had come in really, really tight on one of the images of John Tyler. And I said, oh, no, no, we need to see him wide because he looks so imperious. Like there's so much arrogance in his posture, which we weren't seeing the way it had been framed. But, I mean, the fact that set a precedent that was then followed by 7 other vice presidents is sort of astonishing.
yeah, I think an
I'm gonna
interesting thing that Tyler did. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, James. I just want to explain, like we do have a slight lag, so I apologize that I stepped on you. Please continue.
Oh, I was just going to say another precedent that he started was initially he felt he didn't have to take the oath of office because he took the exact same oath when he was sworn in as vice president, because it's literally the same oath. And and he only agreed to do it in the end because he didn't want there to be any ambiguity or anyone to be able to say, well, you were never sworn in actually as president, because his read was like, hey, I did this oath already, so I'm good to go, I'm president now. But anyway, that set the precedent that in fact the vice president, if they succeed, does need to retake the oath.
Michelle, I have another question from the audience for you, and this one is a little bit more personal about your experience as a filmmaker. So I'm going to read it. It is indeed very interesting and relevant documentary films that provide a unique perspective on the specific political history of a country. I'm watching the film from France. My first question is how, as a director, how is your vision developed on such a subject? Is it possible to incorporate your own critique and analysis while still allowing the viewer to grasp the significance of the issue at hand?
What an interesting question. I mean, my process involves, in the beginning, reading everything I can get my hands on, and everything that's specifically about the subject, and even things that are sort of adjacent to the subject. And I suppose my perspective and analysis comes almost without thinking, which is to say, it's not a fully conscious procedure. I am selecting what's interesting to me. I am structuring the story in a way that feels dramatic and seamless to myself. And I am honing in on the aspects of the story that I think are most revealing. And there's a certain amount of like editorial action that's being taken there. At the same time, I have a graduate degree in history. I take the pedagogical mission of public television really seriously. And so I'm always, in each iteration of the story, each iteration of the script and the cut, I'm looking to make sure that whatever biases I have privileged while I'm putting the thing together unconsciously are not warping the truth of what people should be taking from the film.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Um, since we've gone down this road of talking about the making and the motivation and just your approach in crafting, I'm going to stay with a craft question for a moment. Michelle, are there uh, bits of archival in this film that you particularly love, and that when you found them, they just felt like this is it, like this has to be in there, and this really illustrates something that I was trying to put across?
I don't know if there are any clips that communicate the overall message of the film in some, emblematic way. I mean, there are definitely favorite clips. I would say uh, the shot of it's when Nixon is resigning and he's walking out to the helicopter, and there's a shot of people rolling up the red carpet, which is literally my favorite shot in the whole film. And when I was screening all the footage, I made a note of that shot. And when I went in to sit with my editor and he had made a first pass at that scene, he had that shot in. And I said, okay, good. We're completely on the same page, because were this not in the film, I would have called you on it. I mean, I really love all the footage surrounding Kennedy's assassination, which actually you guys did not see tonight. I hope you will tune in and watch. There's a lot of amazing, amazing footage there. I think one of the things that I love most about working in this period of American history is there's so much. There's just an embarrassment of riches everywhere you look, and it makes it really just exciting to try to put something together visually, because you have a lot of choices.
James, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you have not seen the full film yet. You got to watch
No.
the clip that along with the audience just now. Are there any moments that you saw a video that just stood out to you, or that you hadn't seen before, that you particularly liked?
Well, I found it was interesting because I had never seen any of the footage of Eisenhower when he comes out of the hospital in the wheelchair, and he looked so enfeebled and small. And my images of Eisenhower is, well, the Mr. Clean, the product was based on Eisenhower. That's kind of have this image I have in Eisenhower. And when there's the shot of him coming out of the hospital in the wheelchair, I was like, I almost did a double take. Like, wait a minute, is that Eisenhower? And I knew it was, and it looked like him, but and it was very telling, clearly about his health, at that time. I mean, he really was, not in good shape at all. So yeah, I thought that was great. And again, I'd never seen that before.
Mhm. As you're saying that, it occurs to me that it would probably be really hard to get a shot like that today of a president or
Oh yeah.
even a vice president, because the images are just so controlled, um, and candid, right? Like they're very managed. So it really is striking that level of vulnerability in the commander in
Hmm.
chief, in that shot as well. And just another on the opposite pole for me, we always talk about my favorite footage in the entire film is Gerald Ford and Betty Ford before they move into the White House. These incredible photographs and archival film that you found, Michelle, of Gerald Ford coming out in his bathrobe to collect the morning paper with Secret Service all around, and it's quite amazing, just to see, again, that level of candidness, normalcy around the president. So it's kind of amazing. But thank you
Well,
for.
oh, I was just going to say, that's actually, you know, a part of the film that, again, you guys didn't see tonight, but it goes, what you saw, where it ended, it goes on to talk about, you know, Ford's early days as president and with Betty as first lady, when they were still in their house in Virginia, their suburban house in Virginia. So Cameo is talking about the photos that were taken then, which are amazing, amazing, amazing.
Amazing. We are approaching the end of our time. I actually would love, Michelle, for you to talk about what you hope that people will take away from this film.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, I hope people take away a new understanding of the office of vice president and a new awareness of its importance. I think, you know, even now, 25th Amendment or not, we really only pay attention to the vice president when they're named by their running mate, by the presidential candidate. And we don't give a lot of thought to the person's qualifications for office, or their temperament, or what they might bring to bear on the office. And, you know, if only because they are the next in line for the presidency, I think we ought to think about those things. And then two, I hope people take away this sense that the Constitution is not a fixed document, and it can and should be improved if there are things that we find problematic as a society. It's been done before. It's not easy. Founders made it very difficult to do, but it can be done.
And James, your take on why it actually is important to think about not just the number one slot on the ticket, but the number two as well?
You know, I think it's kind of a numbers game. You know, of the 45 individuals who have served as president, Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and the 24th president. So of the 45, 15 of those presidents were vice president first, and which is a pretty high percentage. You know, it's a third of the individuals who have been president. And those vice presidents have, you know, succeeded the presidency upon the death, resignation of the president, or they've won terms on their own right. And so the numbers alone should wake people up to the need to pay more attention, you know, and to understand, you know, the vice presidency isn't going anywhere. By and large, other than a couple examples, it's just continued to grow over time. So, yeah, and I think this film is a great introduction to, you know, to people's conscious of, hey, you know, this is an important, you know, and particularly since it deals with, so the film deals so much with succession and the reality of vice presidents becoming president.
Thank you for that. And thank you, of course, to Michelle Ferrari for making this really smart, surprising, fresh film for American Experience. So again, Michelle Ferrari, the writer, director, and producer of The American Vice President, James E. Hite, one of our interviewed experts in the film. Thank you both for joining us tonight. And thank you to the audience as well. I hope that you will come and watch the full film premiering on October 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, which, as we said before, is right before the vice presidential debate. The film will premiere on PBS stations nationwide. It will also be available on PBS Passport. So again, thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope that whatever you do, you enjoy the rest of the night. Okay. Good night.